Resuming my discussion of the contested election of 2009, from the last segment you may recall that I mentioned that the presidential debates on live presidential debate on TV really made a difference, getting the masses involved, and suddenly you have the urban youth and the better educated masses regarding Mousavi now as their best hope and the leader of the reform movement, and they began to get involved in his campaigns and helping him out. Now, so this is the last 2 weeks of the election when things really began to heat up. Most analysts had expected the election results to be pretty tight. Remember, Ahmadinejad had the support of the rural masses on the countryside. With Mousavi, however, getting a last minute surge in the polls, most analysts viewed that Mousavi may have an edge in the election, provided that there be a very large turnout of the electorates for the voting. Well, once the election got underway, the turnout was huge. Almost 80% of the eligible voters turned out to vote, but then you had the real shocker. When the Interior Ministry announced the election result, it indicated not a tight election, but a landslide victory for Ahmadinejad, defeating Mousavi nearly 2-1 by a 2-1 margin. In other words, Ahmadinejad got 62% of the votes to Mousavi's 34%. Much of the urban population were shocked. There were many blatant and serious irregularities committed during the voting process as well as during the vote counting. All of this pointed to ballot tampering and election fraud. Now, I'm going to spare you the details of the various charges and the irregularities that were cited, but suffice it to say that Mousavi lodged a complaint to the Guardian Council, who is in charge of the vetting, and it's a very powerful organ. Among the charges that were lodged by Mousavi was one about disappearance of some 14 million unused ballots, which he intimated were used to change the election outcome in favor of Ahmadinejad. When the Guardian Council agreed to a recount, Mousavi rejected that option and instead asked for a brand new election. At the same time, he encouraged his supporters to come out and to protest the election fraudulent outcome. Huge throngs of his supporters came out to the street in Tehran and in other major cities, demanding to know, quote, "Where is my vote?" which now became the familiar refrain of the protesters throughout these cities. The protest became known as the Green Movement, named after the green color symbol used by Mousavi's campaign during the presidential election. To get an understanding of how significant this protest was, it was by far and away the largest mass demonstration and protest in 30 years since the 1979 revolution. So you had to go back to the revolution to see this large of crowd. The regime really appeared to have been shaken to its core. The leader, however, committed a grave error, in my view, that greatly damaged himself as well as his office. Now remember, the leader in the Islamic Republic is supposed to stand above politics and above political fray. Under Ayatollah Khomeini, it was the leader's job to avoid openly siding with any factions. And rather his job was to adjudicate and to maintain the balance among the competing factions of the elites, all of whom were loyal to the very idea of the Islamic Republic and to its governance. However, in the aftermath of the disputed 2009 elections, Khamenei's error was that he entered the political scene and did so rather aggressively, siding with Ahmadinejad. In fact, he called Ahmadinejad's victory, quote, a divine assessment. And he called the protests against the elections illegal. And having named the protests illegal, the regime quickly mobilized plainclothes paramilitary besieges and the Revolutionary Guards to crush the protesters. The videos taken by cell phones really did capture the brutality of the regime's response to these peaceful protests, which often reached the point of outright savagery. One of my favorite moments of the protest was captured in this picture. You can see the courageous Iranian woman in Islamic clad rushing to the aid of the downed protester who is being beaten by the regime's thugs. On June 20th, 2009, a week after the election results were announced, there was a tragic killing of an innocent bystander. And what that tragic murder did was to put a face on the protest movement. Neda Agha Sultan was a 26-year-old philosophy student who was shot by regime's snipers in the neck and died on the spot. The episode was captured by a mobile phone, which was then uploaded to the internet. It went viral almost instantly. According to Time magazine, it was, quote, the most widely witnessed death in human history. So there is a lot of anger on the part of the world about these elections, and especially the ensuing violence perpetrated by the regime. So the violence that was delivered by the regime upon these unarmed, innocent protesters was truly unprecedented in its ferocity as it was in its barbarism. Now, therefore, in phase 6, we have the last phase, and it begins with Ahmadinejad's second term in office to the present time, which is going to be 2013 for the new election that will take place. So Ahmadinejad begins his second term with the country and the governing elite sharply polarized, and his own legitimacy, that of the leader, and the regime's legitimacy are truly in a crisis. So you have a polarized country and a crisis of legitimacy. They all had suffered irremediably, and their legitimacy had ebbed to the lowest level in the 30-year history of the Islamic Republic. So Iran really no longer could call itself a quasi-democracy. The contested election was followed by some 8 months of on and off protest, which at times were bloody and very brutal. At the end, the protesters and their leaders were suppressed brutally, and now, until 2009 election, the main factions that we had seen had significantly shrank. In other words, with the 2009 election, you will see that the governing elites, who broadly speaking were into pro-reform and conservative camps, with the purging of the reformists after the 2009 election, you had a much smaller pool of players, and it had become the narrowest base of elite support for the regime. Many reformists who were part of the governing elites were under house arrest or in jail or were barred from any political activity. So the 2009 election really ended Iran's experiment with quasi-democracy. Iranian elections were no longer competitive in any meaningful sense of that word. Interestingly, Ahmadinejad's second term eventually created a new division, this time among the really surviving faction, the hardliners. So the question is, how did that happen? Again, this was another unexpected outcome. Why unexpected? Because one would expect that given leaders Khamenei's intervention in support of Ahmadinejad's re-election during that contested election, it would only be reasonable to assume that Ahmadinejad must have felt beholden to the leader for politically rescuing him. In reality, though, Ahmadinejad had his own agenda, which he would soon reveal, and that agenda would clash with that of the leader. As president, Ahmadinejad was really bent on exercising a greater power, especially in foreign affairs. On the other hand, the leader Khamenei regarded this not only as insubordination on the part of the president, but as a direct challenge to his overarching authority in all state matters. So let me say a few words about the factions during Ahmadinejad's second term. On the one hand, among the hardliners, which was really the only surviving factions, a smaller faction within the hardliners were loyal to Ahmadinejad and believed in his ideas and views. In other words, they favored a diminished cleric's role and influence and authority over state matters. Especially, they were concerned about the power of the supreme leader over the affairs of the state. So in terms of elites, there were a group of them that went along with Ahmadinejad's idea of the president becoming more powerful vis-a-vis the leader. In terms of mass support, Ahmadinejad's main support base came from the poor, especially in small villages and the rural part of Iran. These people had become the main beneficiaries of Ahmadinejad's subsidies and handouts. And they also identified with Ahmadinejad's humble background as son of a blacksmith. On the other hand, a second, much bigger faction among the hardliners, governing elites, remained loyal to the supreme leader Khamenei. These included most of the Revolutionary Guards. It included conservative clerics who had a lot of power. It included influential merchants, as well as hardline lay politicians. These people also controlled the parliament, and with their control of the parliament and support of the leader, were able to block Ahmadinejad and his allies from passing their legislation or not approving some of his cabinet members. And oftentimes when Ahmadinejad insubordination seemed to go beyond the pale, they threatened him with impeachment. The code term these people used to refer to Ahmadinejad's supporter was, quote, the deviant current. The deviant meaning deviation from the path laid out by the leader. So, quite interestingly, even though the leader ended up rescuing Ahmadinejad's presidency's second term, you have a major rift developing between the leader and Ahmadinejad. And by 2011, the leader even hinted that he may once again bring about the office of prime minister, which was eliminated when he himself became the leader, to threaten Ahmadinejad that the president may become only a ceremonial position. So in the meantime, Ahmadinejad also faces other challenges. The most important among them, of course, was the escalation in the confrontation between Iran and the West over Iran's nuclear program. Iran got several rounds of new sanctions that are now making the Iranian economy bleed. In 2010, the deteriorating economy forced Ahmadinejad to eliminate his favorite tool to keep the poor loyal to him, the food subsidies. In so doing, he ended up replacing the food subsidies with a monthly stipend of approximately $38 per person for every Iranian. In the meantime, both inflation and unemployment have been sharply on the rise. In fact, at the beginning of 2012, the official inflation rate was announced by the government to be around 28%. On the other hand, knowledgeable economists estimate the rate closer to about 110%. And to make matter worse for Ahmadinejad, the government revealed a shocking $2.6 billion corruption scam, which was by far the largest banking scandal in the history of the Islamic Republic. It is widely believed that the announcement of the scam was approved by the leader to further undercut Ahmadinejad. So as Iran moves toward the presidential elections in June 2013, Ahmadinejad is already a lame duck and a much weaker president, and a lot of that has to do with him deciding to forge a more independent path for himself and challenging the leader's authority. But then, so is the very political legitimacy of the Islamic Republic and its leader. So the 2009 election really ended up undercutting both the leader and the president of Iran.